week, a Danish newspaper set off a firestorm when it published controversial cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad.
The more there is a culture of perceiving blasphemy as a serious crime, the more religious violence you have in society. The key to free speech is courage. You have to cultivate tolerance in order to cultivate a culture of free speech. Many politicians who favor diversity when it comes to religion, ethnicity and culture, they do not welcome the same diversity when it comes to speech.
Hello, I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spiked. I'm delighted to be joined by Flemming Rose. Flemming, you were at one point the culture editor of a Danish newspaper called Jyllands-Posten, and you published 12 cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad that shook the world. People will know this internationally as the Danish Muhammad cartoons controversy. It sparked an extraordinary amount of violence. I think there have been 200 deaths linked to this incident. You yourself have had to live under security protection. Can you take us back to the beginning of the story? Why did you publish these cartoons? What was the original context?
Thanks for the invitation, Fraser, and thanks for having me. The important thing here is that those cartoons didn't come out of the blue. It's just it's not that I or somebody else thought, well, let's see if we can offend millions of Muslims out there. They were published as part of an internal debate in Denmark that also had some external dimensions, and it began in the middle of August in 2005, when a Danish children's writer went public. He went to the Danish newswire service, Ritzau Bureau, and gave an interview to them saying, you know, I wrote this children's book about the life of the Prophet Muhammad, but I had big difficulties finding an illustrator. And in Denmark, as in the UK, when you publish a children's book, usually you have images of the main character. And he said that some illustrators turned down his offer. It turned out later, in fact, one illustrator did do the job, but he didn't do any images of the prophet so you could see his face. And the illustrator who finally took on the job insisted on anonymity. He did not want his name on the cover of the book or inside. And that is a form of self-censorship. Because you are afraid of repercussions, you do not want to publish under your own name. We know that from authoritarian and other repressive regimes. And that started a debate in Denmark. Some thought that was a PR stunt by the author to sell more books. Others claimed, yes, there are self-censorship when it comes to the coverage of Islam in the movies, in books, in newspapers, theaters, and so on and so forth. And that story was, in fact, on the front page of most newspapers in Denmark. And the debate was about these issues. I mean, are there self-censorship or not? Is this author lying to us, or is he telling the truth? And later, the illustrator, in fact, came on the record acknowledging that he had, in fact, committed self-censorship. And he was referring to the fate of Theo van Gogh in the Netherlands, who was killed on the streets of Amsterdam, November 1st, 2004. And he was also referring to Salman Rushdie and the Satanic Verses back in 1989, when he was the subject to a fatwa by Ayatollah Khomeini. So this debate was going on, and we had an internal discussion at the newspaper. How can we follow up on this story and find out more? And then a reporter came up with this idea. why don't we invite cartoonists or illustrators to draw the prophet? And then we can find out if there is self-censorship. We have this principle, foundational principle in journalism: don't tell, show it.
Yeah.
And so this was a classical journalistic exercise. And I got in touch with the head of the Danish Cartoonist Association, and after some back and forth, he said, "Okay, let's try and do this exercise." And I wrote to all the members of that association, and I received 12 cartoons. That's about 50% of the active members back then. And then we had an internal discussion at the newspaper whether this was a story or if it was just a stunt on behalf of this writer. So we in fact hold back for 10 days. And during that time, several things happened. At the Tate in London, you had a retrospective exhibition by John Latham,
Yeah.
who had this installation called "God is Great," with a copy of the Bible, the Quran, and the Talmud torn into pieces and layered in a piece of glass. And the Tate board withdrew that piece of art without consulting the artist and without consulting the curator. That was without asking the police of London if they saw any threat to the public. That was a clear example of self-censorship. There was a similar case in Gothenburg, Sweden, where a Muslim-born Algerian French artist had a painting, a man and a woman having sex, and at the top of the painting was the first line, the first verse of the Quran. And Muslims in Sweden called the director of the museum and complained, and she withdrew that painting without asking the artist and without asking the curator of that exhibition. And we had a stand-up comedian in Denmark who went on the record saying, I am not afraid of pissing on the Bible in front of a camera, but I'm afraid of doing the same with the Quran. So he made a difference between two world religions in how he would treat them when it comes to satire. Finally, there was also a case in Finland, in fact, with a translation of Ayaan Hirsi Ali's, the Muslim critic, Somalia-born feminist who published a book in Sweden, a book of essays. And it turned out that the translator of that book also insisted on not having his name on the book. And finally, in Copenhagen, there was a meeting. This is the aftermath of the 7/7 bombings in London in 2005. And the Danish prime minister had a meeting with imams in Denmark. And two of the imams called on the prime minister to prevent further criticism of Islam in the public, which to me was a call for censorship, asking the government to use its influence to make sure that Danish media could not publish certain point of views. And all that, and it turned out later when I went back and looked at it, even more things happened within these, this week or 10 days that convinced me and the other editors and the newspaper that, in fact, there was a news story here. And then we proceeded and published the cartoons on September 30th, 2005.
And so you published the cartoons, but in terms of the sort of international reaction, particularly from Muslim groups, that takes a bit of time, doesn't it? It's not an immediate backlash.
That's true. On the day of the publication, I received, I think, a couple of phone calls. I received a call from a newspaper vendor in one of the parts of Copenhagen where a lot of Muslims live, and he complained and said that he would not sell Jyllands-Posten anymore. But as an editor, I received these calls every now and then. I mean,
Yeah.
people are quite often dissatisfied with what is being published in the newspaper. So I didn't take that as any kind of out of the normal. And then a couple of weeks later, there was a demonstration, a peaceful demonstration in Copenhagen against the cartoons, and there was a lively debate in Denmark. But you're right, it took 3 months or so for the story to become a big international event. And that was mainly triggered by international the International Islamic Conference. They had a summit, I think, in Saudi Arabia, and some of the Danish imams who had lost the debate in Denmark, they took their case to the Muslim world internationally, and they sent delegations to Egypt, to Lebanon, and then they participated in this conference in Saudi Arabia, where it became a big public and international issue with calls for demonstrations. One of the funny things, or one of the curious things here, is in fact that the imams brought along cartoons that had not been published in Jyllandsposten, as if the cartoons they complained about were not offensive enough. They said they had received some of these cartoons in the email, but these cartoons were not in the public space in Denmark. And then at the end of January, beginning of February, you had violence. You had demonstrations in Afghanistan, in Egypt, in the Palestinian territories. The Egyptian government, in fact, used the cartoons. If you remember back then, in 2005, in November 2005, for the first time, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt was allowed to participate in a parliamentarian election. So the Mubarak secular government used the cartoons in the campaign to demonstrate that they were the true defenders of Muslims' rights in Egypt. And you had the same in the Palestinian territories. It was not Hamas that used the cartoon, it was in fact the secular Fatah. On reflection, I will say that it was not a nature-given thing that this would become a big international scandal.
Yeah.
Lots of people afterwards say, well, you should have known. I mean, you can tell that if you do something like that. But it turns out that if you go back, there were publications of Muhammad cartoons that did not cause the same kind of controversy. And I will say that this was in large part driven by domestic agendas in specific Muslim countries, where these cartoons became a convenient tool in the hands of different political forces.
And what did all of that mean for you personally, for your editorial team, for your newspaper? Did you feel as if you were personally in danger at that point?
I mean, in fact, at no point I thought about that, but it's and Denmark is one of the most peaceful countries in the world. We never had to manage these kind of situations, but of course, as time went by, Denmark became a very popular terrorist target, and we did have violence in 2015 when one individual was killed at a public event about blasphemy, and a Jewish guard at the synagogue in Copenhagen was also killed. But I mean, I lived with bodyguards for many years, so because of that, people took care of my security, and personally, I did not feel at any point that my life was in danger, even though I received death threats and I had some unpleasant confrontations in public spaces, and I learned later that there were in fact specific people who tried to find me and kill me, but fortunately they didn't succeed.
Obviously, this is not a unique case. Unfortunately, we had the fatwa against Salman Rushdie before you. Later on, 10 years later, we had the Charlie Hebdo attacks. This intolerance is still with us, would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. And if I take my own government, in the aftermath of the terrorist attack in Copenhagen in 2015, that was in fact just a couple of weeks after Charlie Hebdo. And I knew a lot of the people who were killed in Paris. In fact, I appeared as a witness in a court case against Charlie Hebdo back in 2008. So these people were not just colleagues, but also friends. So it was a big shock. I was not surprised by the attack if you had followed events, but you're always shocked when people get killed. But if I take my own government in 2017, they reacted to the terrorist attack in 2015 by getting rid of the blasphemy law that had been on the books in Denmark for decades. And I think that was the right response. But fast forward, I think 2023, the same Danish government passed a new blasphemy law targeting Quran burnings in Denmark. So in fact, they reinstated the blasphemy law that they had suspended just 6 years earlier, and I think that is part of a trend. I think that I think there are many factors here, but one of them is the changing geopolitical landscape, that the West is losing influence and power, and the West is rising. And I think one of the motives behind this for the Danish government was that a lot of the global South and the Islamic countries, they had been sitting on the fence during the war in Ukraine. And they very much wanted them to join sanctions and the coalition against Russia. And these countries singled out Denmark and Sweden, where Koran burnings also had taken place. So I think that was a way that was reflecting a changing geopolitical landscape, where countries in the West have to pay more attention to what governments think in the global South, and specifically in the Muslim world.
And it seems like these blasphemy laws, they're not just a capitulation potentially to extremists, but also do they not give a green light to this kind of violence and intolerance? I mean, the Danish government is effectively saying, well, anyone who, we might not like people taking these matters into their own hands, but they have a point. Is that not the problem?
Exactly, and in fact, I think you can phrase it in a polemical way by saying that blasphemy laws, in fact, incite violence. If you take the blasphemy law in Pakistan, it's a death penalty. It means you have this blasphemy is perceived as a crime similar to killing 100 people in a mosque. And there have been studies around the world tracking these blasphemy laws. And it turns out there is a correlation between how harsh these blasphemy laws are and religious violence. That the more there is a culture of perceiving blasphemy as a serious crime, the more religious violence you have in society. So yeah, I agree absolutely with your question, Fraser, that blasphemy laws is not a way to fight religious violence. Quite the opposite. But over time, people will internalize these new blasphemy laws. And that is what happened in what happens in totalitarian countries. In the beginning, you have a fight about what are the limits, and some people get killed, a lot get sent to prison. But with time, the majority of the population, they internalize these limits that are being imposed on them, and they don't go there. They don't challenge the limits because they know it have severe consequences. And I think it's the same with these laws. And if you take Western Europe, many years ago, I read a book by an American historian, Oscar Handlin, The Uprooted. And that's the book about how integration and assimilation worked in the United States of America in the 19th century. And Handlin basically traces three phases. The first, the first one is separation, that different communities, Muslim, Christians, Jews, atheists, they live in separate quarters and they do not interact with one another. And then you have a phase where you have confrontation, because if you live in the same society and you are citizens in the same society, you have to interact and you have to work out some common rules. And I think, in fact, that the Muhammad cartoons, they were part of this second phase, because it caused a confrontation, which sometimes, in fact, is healthy, because then you have a debate about what is up for negotiation and what is not. And then in the third phase, the majority in society, they agree about new common norms. And my fear and my concern is that the new norms that we are working out in many Western European countries imply some form of blasphemy that many countries, in fact, got rid of many years ago, because the politicians many politicians who favor diversity when it comes to religion, ethnicity, and culture, they do not welcome the same diversity when it comes to speech, which should
Yeah.
be natural. I mean, if you say A, you also have to say B. But they think that the more cultural, ethnic, and religious diversity we have in society, the less diversity we need when it comes to speech. And I think that is not the right trade-off in a multicultural, democratic, and free society.
And finally, I just want to return to something you talked about at the very beginning, which is self-censorship. Um, Obviously, it seems as if the only way really to fight this is to not be cowed, to not allow ourselves to be afraid of the consequences, even though those might be very, very real, as we've seen. Do you think that's the right approach? That's the best way to challenge it, to exercise our freedom, even if we might feel afraid to.
Absolutely. And I think in general, I mean, the key to free speech is courage, because free speech in so many ways goes against human nature. I mean, you don't want to be exposed to point of views that you dislike. Your instinctive reaction is to shut it down, to turn off the television, not to read the newspaper. That's the instinctive reaction. You have to cultivate tolerance in order to cultivate a culture of free speech. But I think there is another problem with self-censorship compared to censorship, because censorship is visible. The problem with self-censorship is that it is invisible, and you can only talk about it if people are honest about their motives. And self-censorship is not a courageous thing. And therefore, a lot of people will find other nice explanations for self-censoring. If you take the cartoons, Danish media sometimes say when they are not publishing them when it's relevant from a news point of view. They will say, well, we now know what the cartoons look like, so we don't have to publish them. And then my reply is, we also know what Donald Trump looks like. But every time there is a story about Donald Trump, we have a picture of him. So why make the difference? And it's clear why they make the difference, because they are afraid of the consequences. Danilo Kish, I think a Serbian writer who passed away many years ago, and who lived and wrote in socialist Yugoslavia, that was not a free country. I think he had a very good definition of self-censorship. He said, self-censorship is reading your own text with other people's eyes.
Mm.
That is, you are not expressing yourself the way you want, but you always have the eyes of the censor somewhere in the back of your head. And of course, it can be healthy to read your own text with other people's eyes to improve it. But that was not what he had in mind. He, of course, had in mind this kind of intimidation, and you do not want to be an outcast or an outlier, and therefore you try to conform with what the common point of view is.
Flemming, thank you very much.